I'm more of a loner, preferring the tranquility of nature to the hustle and bustle of city life. That's why I jumped at the chance when my buddy offered me his family's old cabin for a week-long getaway. Little did I know that this peaceful retreat would turn into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, about a 3-hour drive from Minneapolis. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, I could see why my friend's family had held onto this place for generations. It was a classic log cabin, weathered but sturdy, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. The surrounding forest was dense and quiet, broken only by the occasional bird call. I settled in quickly, unpacking my supplies and getting a fire going in the old stone fireplace. The interior was cozy, with well-worn furniture and faded family photos on the walls. It felt lived in, like a place where countless happy memories had been made. That first night, exhausted from the drive and the fresh air, I fell into a deep sleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. And that's when the dream started. In my dream, I saw a young woman with long, dark hair sitting by the fireplace. She was wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 1970s, and she seemed sad, almost lost. The dream was incredibly vivid. I could smell wood smoke and hear the crackle of the fire. When I woke up, the memory of it clung to me like cobwebs. I shrugged it off as just a weird dream, probably triggered by sleeping in a new place. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I dreamed of an older man, maybe in his 60s, chopping wood outside the cabin. He had a thick beard and wore a flannel shirt. Again, the dream felt so real that I could almost feel the chill in the air and smell the fresh cut pine. By the third night, I was starting to get freaked out. The dreams kept coming, each featuring a different person at the cabin. A young couple on what looked like their honeymoon. A middle-aged woman painting at an easel on the porch. A group of college kids having a party. Each dream was set in a different time period, but they all took place at the cabin. What really got to me was how real these dreams felt. They weren't like normal dreams that fade away as soon as you wake up. These stayed with me, clear as memories. I could describe every detail of the people's faces, their clothes, even the sounds of their voices. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was picking up on the cabin's history, imagining the kinds of people who might have stayed here over the years. But deep down, I knew it was something more than that. On the fourth day, I decided to do some digging. I called my friend and casually asked about the cabin's history. That's when things took a turn for the truly bizarre. "Nick, it's funny you should ask," my friend said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "There's something I probably should have told you before you went up there. The cabin. Well, it's got a bit of a reputation." My stomach dropped as he continued. "Over the years, there have been a few incidents. People who've stayed there and then just vanished without a trace. The last one was back in the 90s, but it's happened a handful of times since my great-grandpa built the place." I felt a chill run down my spine as he described some of the disappearances. A honeymooning couple in the 50s. A retired teacher in the 70s. A group of college students in the early 90s. Each one matched a person or group I'd seen in my dreams. "We don't really talk about it," my friend said. "Most of the family thinks it's just bad luck or coincidence. But my grandma, she always said there was something not right about that place. Said it had a way of holding on to people somehow. I wanted to leave right then and there, but a freak thunderstorm had washed out the only road back to town. I was stuck for at least another day. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't bring myself to. I sat up in the living room, every light in the cabin blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. As the hours ticked by, I could have sworn I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, heard whispers just on the edge of hearing. When dawn finally broke, I threw my things in the car and got the hell out of there, barely waiting for the road to be cleared. I've never been so relieved to see the Minneapolis skyline in my life. It's been years since that week at the cabin, but I still can't shake the memory of those dreams. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the faces of those lost souls vivid in my mind. I can't help but wonder, what if I had fallen asleep that last night? Would I have become just another story, another face in someone else's dream? If you are enjoying it, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button to support my channel. The 2003 Northeast blackout was a massive power outage that affected millions of people across the United States and Canada. While Raleigh, North Carolina wasn't directly impacted by this event, it did experience its own share of power outages that year due to severe thunderstorms. This story is based on one man's unsettling experience during such a blackout in Raleigh. It was a typical summer evening in Raleigh. The air was thick with humidity, and dark clouds were rolling in, promising one of those sudden, intense thunderstorms we often get. I was home alone, my wife away on a business trip. I'd just finished dinner when the first clap of thunder shook the house. The storm picked up quickly. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees in our backyard. I was settling in for a quiet night of reading when suddenly, everything went dark. The power had gone out. Now, I'm not usually bothered by blackouts. We get them occasionally during bad storms. But something felt different this time. The darkness seemed thicker, somehow more oppressive. I fumbled around for my phone to use as a flashlight and made my way to the kitchen to find some candles. As I lit the third candle, a shiver ran down my spine, and I felt a breeze, like someone had just passed by me. It wasn't the window, they were all closed. I turned around, holding up the light from my phone, but I didn't see anything. Just the familiar shapes of my kitchen in the flickering candlelight. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was just being silly. But the feeling didn't go away. I decided to do a quick check around the house, just to ease my mind. As I walked through the living room, I heard a soft thump upstairs. My heart started racing. It could have been anything, a book falling off a shelf, maybe. But combined with the strange feeling I already had, it sent my imagination into overdrive. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and scared in the quiet house. No answer, of course. What was I expecting? I slowly climbed the stairs, the light from my phone casting long shadows on the walls. The landing was clear, as was the guest room. As I got closer to our bedroom, the feeling of not being alone got stronger. I pushed the door open, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That's when I noticed something odd. The closet door was open. I always keep it closed, force of habit from childhood fears. I approached it cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached for the door handle, I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled around, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, moving down the hallway towards the stairs. They were clear as day, the unmistakable sound of bare feet on hardwood floors. I was frozen in place, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I'm not sure how long I stood there, listening to those phantom footsteps moving around downstairs. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Suddenly, the power came back on. The sudden flood of light almost blinded me. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There on the hardwood floor, were wet footprints leading from the bedroom door to where I stood. I ran downstairs, checking every room, every closet, behind every curtain. Nothing. No sign of an intruder. No open windows. No forced locks. Just those unexplained wet footprints upstairs. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. When my wife returned the next day, I told her everything. She was skeptical, of course, but she could see how shaken I was. We've had other storms since then, other blackouts, but I've never experienced anything like that night again. Sometimes when the power flickers during a storm, I feel that same chill down my spine, and I wonder what really happened that night. It was mid-July when my boyfriend, Mark, and I decided to escape the city heat and head to Lake Stillwater, a secluded spot about 3 hours east of Portland. We'd heard about it from some friends who raved about its crystal clear waters and the absolute tranquility of the place. It sounded perfect. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the pine-covered hills surrounding the lake. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. We set up our tent on a small clearing near the shore, the lake's surface like glass, reflecting the deepening blue of the sky. As night fell, we sat by our campfire, roasting marshmallows and planning our hike for the next day. That's when I first felt a sudden chill that seemed to come from nowhere. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the night air settling in. But then I saw her. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something or someone standing at the water's edge. I turned my head for a better look, and for a split second, I saw a young woman. She was pale, almost translucent, with long dark hair that seemed to float around her as if she were underwater. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a jolt of fear run through me. I blinked, and she was gone. "Mark," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Did you see that?" He looked at me, confused. "See what?" I described what I'd seen, but Mark just laughed it off, saying it was probably just shadows from the fire playing tricks on my eyes. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the lapping of water against the shore, seemed amplified. And always, there was that persistent chill in the air, even though it was the middle of summer. The next morning, we hiked around the lake. It was a beautiful day, warm and sunny, but I couldn't shake my unease. As we walked, we came across an old, weather-beaten sign near a small cove. It was a memorial, dedicated to a young woman named Hannah who had drowned in the lake 20 years ago. My blood ran cold. The description on the sign, long dark hair, early 20s, matched exactly what I had seen the night before. That evening, as the sun began to set, the air grew heavy with an unnatural fog that crept in from the lake. Mark was busy preparing dinner at our campsite, but something drew me to the water's edge. As I stood there, watching the mist swirl over the surface of the lake, I saw her again. This time, she was clearer, more solid. She stood in the shallow water, her dress clinging to her like it was wet. Her eyes, filled with a deep sadness, locked onto mine. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. Then she began to open her mouth, her face twisting as if she were straining to speak, her voice somewhat hoarse, like a whisper as she spoke. "Help me," she said. I must have made some sound because suddenly Mark was beside me, asking what was wrong. When I turned back to the lake, she was gone, but the water where she had stood was rippling, as if something had just disturbed its surface. We left the next morning, cutting our trip short. I couldn't bear to spend another night there, not with the feeling of those sad eyes watching me, that whispered plea echoing in my ears. In the weeks that followed, I researched the history of Lake Stillwater and the drowning that had occurred there. Hannah had been a local girl, just 22 years old, who'd gone for a late night swim and never returned. Her body was found days later, tangled in the weeds at the bottom of the lake. Some locals I spoke to mentioned that there had been other sightings over the years, a pale figure walking the shoreline, unexplained cold spots, whispers in the night. Most dismissed these as campfire tales, but I knew better. I still camp, but I've never returned to Lake Stillwater. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm in my tent, I'll feel a sudden chill and remember those sad eyes, that whispered plea. And I'll wonder if Hannah is still there, walking the shores of that haunted lake, waiting for someone to help her find peace. It was a crisp October night, leaves crunching under my feet as I made my way down Elm Street. The old streetlights cast long shadows, and a thin mist hung in the air, giving the whole scene an eerie quality. I'd walked this route 100 times before, but something felt different that night. As I approached the bend where Elm Street meets Willow Lane, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the somber notes of a funeral dirge. I quickened my pace, curiosity getting the better of me. When I rounded the corner, I couldn't believe my eyes. There, in the middle of the night, was a funeral procession. Men in dark suits and women in black dresses walked slowly down the street, following an ornate horse-drawn hearse. The clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoed off the surrounding buildings. My heart raced as I watched, frozen in place. This couldn't be happening, could it? Funerals at midnight? It didn't make sense. But there it was, right in front of me. As the procession passed by, I noticed something odd about the mourners. Their clothes seemed outdated. The women wore high-necked dresses and elaborate hats that looked like they belonged in the early 1900s. The men's suits had a distinctly vintage cut to them. I blinked hard, wondering if I was dreaming. But when I opened my eyes, the procession was still there, moving slowly towards the old Millbrook Cemetery at the end of Willow Lane. Goosebumps raised on my arms as a chill ran through me. I had the strangest feeling that I was witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see, but I couldn't look away. As the last of the mourners passed by, I noticed an elderly woman at the rear of the group. She turned and looked directly at me, her eyes wide with what looked like surprise, or was it fear? She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then shook her head and hurried to catch up with the others. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching as the procession disappeared into the mist surrounding the cemetery. Only when they were completely out of sight did I finally snap out of my trance-like state. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to check the time. It was 2:37 a.m. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. What had I just seen? The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd witnessed. I decided to ask around town, hoping someone could shed some light on the strange nighttime funeral. My first stop was Maggie's Diner, a local hangout where all the town gossip circulated. I slid into a booth across from Old Joe, a lifelong Millbrook resident who seemed to know everything about the town's history. "Hey, Joe," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "You hear about any funerals happening last night?" Joe looked at me over his coffee cup, his bushy eyebrows furrowed. "Funerals? At night? No, nothing like that." "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then decided to tell him what I'd seen. As I spoke, Joe's expression grew increasingly concerned. "Sophia," he said slowly when I finished, "are you sure about what you saw?" I nodded emphatically. "I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it happened." They were heading towards the old cemetery. Joe set down his coffee cup with a clunk. "That's impossible," he said. his voice barely above a whisper. The Millbrook Cemetery has been abandoned for decades. The last burial there was in 1920. A chill ran down my spine. But I saw them go in there. The whole procession. Joe shook his head. Nobody goes in there anymore. It's all overgrown, and the gates have been locked for years. I left the diner feeling more confused than ever. Throughout the day, I asked other locals about what I'd seen, but everyone had the same reaction as Joe. They looked at me with concern, insisting that no funeral could have taken place in that cemetery. That evening, determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I decided to visit the old Millbrook Cemetery myself. As I approached the rusted gates, my heart sank. Joe was right, the place was completely overgrown, with weeds and vines choking the weathered headstones. The gates were secured with a heavy padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I peered through the bars, squinting in the fading light. And that's when I saw it, a fresh path cut through the overgrowth, leading to a newly disturbed patch of earth near the back of the cemetery. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I snapped a picture. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. The photo showed nothing but an unbroken sea of weeds and vines. I looked up from my phone, blinking in disbelief. The path was gone. The disturbed earth had vanished. It was as if what I'd seen a moment ago had never existed. I backed away from the gates, my mind reeling. What was happening to me? Had I imagined the whole thing? As I turned to leave, a gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of that funeral dirge I'd heard the night before. I froze, straining my ears, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I hurried home, locking the door behind me and drawing the curtains. That night, I barely slept, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and the echoing sound of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. The image of that ghostly procession haunted me, driving me to dig deeper into Millbrook's history. My search led me to the town's historical society, where I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records. That's when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An article from 1919 detailed a tragedy that had struck Millbrook. A fire at the local theater had claimed dozens of lives. The town, overwhelmed by the number of victims, had been forced to hold multiple funerals, including some at night. But it was the photograph accompanying the article that truly shook me. There, in grainy black and white, was the same ornate hearse I'd seen that night. And standing beside it, looking directly at the camera, was the elderly woman who had turned to look at me during the procession. With trembling hands, I read on. The final funeral procession, the article stated, had been scheduled for midnight on October 15, 1919, exactly 100 years to the day before I witnessed it. I sat back, my mind reeling. Somehow, I had glimpsed a moment frozen in time, a century-old tragedy replaying itself on its centennial. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the old cemetery. This time, I noticed something I'd overlooked before, a small plaque, weathered and half hidden by overgrowth. It commemorated the victims of the theater fire, many of whom were buried in unmarked graves. I cleared away the weeds and placed a small bouquet of flowers beneath the plaque. As I stood there, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The unsettling feeling that had plagued me since that night began to fade. I realized then that what I had witnessed wasn't something to fear, but rather a solemn reminder of a tragedy long forgotten by most. Those souls, still honoring their lost loved ones a century later, weren't meant to frighten, but to be remembered. Now, when I pass by the old Millbrook Cemetery on my nightly walks, I no longer feel watched or uneasy. Instead, I offer a quiet nod of acknowledgement to those who rest there, grateful for the glimpse into history they allowed me to witness. The experience changed me, certainly, but not in the way I initially feared. It deepened my appreciation for my town's history and the lives that came before mine. And on quiet nights, when I catch the faint strains of that mournful dirge on the wind, I smile, knowing that Millbrook's past is never truly forgotten. I've always been fascinated by the history of our family home, a charming Victorian-era house that's been standing for over a century in a small town just outside of Boston. But nothing could have prepared me for the chilling discovery I made during our recent renovation. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to tackle the living room wallpaper. As I carefully peeled back the layers of old paper, my fingers brushed against something solid hidden in the wall. Curiosity piqued. I gently pried it out. It was a small wooden box, its surface dulled by years of dust. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and photographs. Most were typical family portraits from the early 1900s, showing stern-faced men in suits and women in high-collared dresses. But one photo made my blood run cold. It was a family of 5, posed in front of our very house. The parents stood proudly behind 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The boy, who looked about 10 years old, was staring directly at the camera with a slight smirk. And he looked exactly like me at that age. I mean, it wasn't just a passing resemblance. It was like looking at my own childhood photo. The same unruly mop of dark hair, the same slightly crooked smile, even the same dimple on the left cheek. My hands shook as I turned the photo over, finding a date scrawled in faded ink, June 15th, 1908. "Hey, babe, can you come here for a sec?" I called out to my wife, Sarah, trying to keep my voice steady. She appeared in the doorway, wiping paint from her hands. "What's up, Mike?" "Find some hidden treasure," she joked, but her smile faded as she saw my pale face. I wordlessly handed her the photo. Her eyes widened as she looked from the image to me and back again. "Oh my God, Mike, that boy, yeah," I said softly. "It's like looking in a mirror, isn't it?" We spent the rest of the evening poring over the contents of the box. We found letters, more photos, and even a small diary belonging to the mother, Elizabeth Carver. The family had lived in our house from 1905 to 1910, when they suddenly moved away after the mysterious disappearance of their son, James, the boy in the photo who looked like me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing James's face, my face, every time I closed my eyes. The logical part of my brain insisted it was just a coincidence, a quirk of genetics, perhaps. But a nagging feeling in my gut told me there was more to this story. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching the Carver family. I scoured local archives, old newspapers, and even reached out to a genealogist. The more I learned, the more unsettled I became. James Carver had vanished without a trace on a warm summer evening in 1910. He had gone out to play in the backyard and never returned. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no clue to his fate was ever found. The family moved away shortly after, unable to bear living in the house where their son had disappeared. As I delved deeper into the mystery, strange things started happening around the house. Objects would move when no one was looking. The temperature in the living room would suddenly drop, even on warm days. Once, while I was in the attic going through some old boxes, I distinctly heard a child's laughter echoing from downstairs, but when I rushed down, Sarah swore she hadn't heard anything. The final straw came one night when I woke up to use the bathroom. As I passed by the mirror in the hallway, I caught a glimpse of movement. For a split second, I saw not my own reflection, but that of a young boy, James, staring back at me with sad eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. I've never considered myself superstitious, but this experience has shaken me to my core. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it all as an elaborate coincidence. But another part of me, a part I'm not entirely comfortable acknowledging, wonders if there's something more at play here. Is it possible that some part of James Carver has lingered in this house all these years? Could there be a connection between us that transcends time and logic? Or am I simply letting an old photograph and a tragic story get the better of me? Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.